Good morning. Happy Easter. The room was full of heavy sighs and bitter tears. It felt like the walls were closing in on us. Suddenly the door burst open. Our eyes darted towards it for fear of whom it might be. It was two of the women, Mary and Martha. They'd been to tend to the body of Jesus. When I looked at them, my heart sank. Surely they were not going to tell us that Jesus' tomb had been desecrated. They couldn't have tended to his body in that short a time. But then I looked again, and their faces were not drawn like ours. They were actually smiling. They had something they couldn't wait to tell us. Mary and Martha seemed more like excited children than women who'd lost someone they loved dearly. The tomb is empty, they said. We saw an angel, and he told us that Jesus has risen from the dead. A stunned silence came over the room. Part of me wanted to believe them, but I was not going to let myself suffer another disappointment. John was the first to speak. Let's think about this carefully, he said. Are you sure? Could you not have just imagined it? We are sure, they said. We didn't imagine it. He looked over to Peter with a sceptical but caring look on his face. We better go and take a look then, he said. John and Peter seemed to have been gone for hours. We paced the floor to use up our nervous energy. We suppressed our desperate hopes and kept looking out of the window to see if they were coming back. Finally they arrived, walking, not running, frowning, not smiling. Their footsteps were heavy as they came up the stairs. And we prepared ourselves for the worst possible news. These women must have let their imagination run away with them. Perhaps the tomb had been desecrated. The door creaked open, and they entered slowly. What's the news then? I asked. Well, said Peter, the tomb was empty, but we saw neither Jesus nor the women they told us about. We slumped in our seats and buried our heads in our hands. After a few moments, I looked up and tapped Cleopas on the shoulder. I suggested that it might be better if we go out of the room and head away from Jerusalem. It was early afternoon, the midday heat had passed, and there was no point hanging around in that oppressive atmosphere any longer. We trod the winding streets of the city. After another 25 minutes, we reached the edge of the plateau and looked back to the place where our hopes had been shattered. A little later, we were on a road that led to a town called Emmaus. And although we felt free from the tense atmosphere that had filled the room, we carried on talking about events of the past week. We spoke about the way in which the religious leaders had orchestrated Jesus' trial and execution. The crowd had turned so ugly. We'd let Jesus down so badly. And he had got through the whole ordeal with such dignity. Those who were brave enough to stay at this site of execution told us that he actually prayed for the people who were cursing him, asking God to forgive them. Cleopas and I were so absorbed in our conversation we hadn't noticed someone drawing alongside us. We didn't know who he was, but he seemed very interested in our conversation. What are you talking about? He asked. We stood still and looked at him with amazement, our faces ravaged by the misery of the last 4 days. How could he have come from Jerusalem and not known what was going on? "You must be the only person who doesn't know what's been happening over the last few days," said Cleopas. "What do you mean?" he replied. "Well, we seized on the opportunity to tell someone outside of our little circle about the things that we've been struggling with. We began by telling him about Jesus and described him as a mighty prophet, favoured by God, recognised by the people. Then we told him about the way in which the religious leaders had arrested him, condemned him to death and handed him over to the governor of execution. We brought our account right up to date by telling him about the glimmer of hope brought by the women who told us that his tomb was empty. Hope that was dashed when Peter and John returned to tell us that although the body had gone, there was no sign of the angels they claimed to have spoken to. And we thought he was the one who was going to save us," we said. After spilling our hearts to this stranger, we expected some sympathy, but we didn't get it. "You are such foolish people," he said, firmly but kindly. "You find it so hard to believe what the prophets wrote. Didn't they predict that God had promised that the king would have to suffer all these things before he began his rule?" He went on to talk about the scriptures, and his knowledge of them was amazing. He went right back to the law, telling us how the sacrifice anticipated the Messiah's suffering. Then he told us about the way in which the prophets and Psalms spoke of the same thing. We were right to expect the Messiah to be glorious, but first, the man said, he had to suffer. For the first time in days, we'd been lifted out of the blackness which had engulfed us. This man's words made sense. He gave us hope. And we were so taken up with what he was saying, we were hardly aware of the time passing. We trod all 7 miles of that long road, but with a new sense of hope that had been given to us, we would gladly have gone twice that distance to hear more. When we arrived at Emmaus, the stranger acted as if he was going further. It was late. So we urged him to stay with us, and he accepted the offer. Food was set out. We asked him to thank God for it. He agreed, picked up a small loaf of bread, asked for blessing on it, broke it into pieces, then handed it out to us. It's difficult to explain what happened next. It was like one of those times when you've been unable to see, when your eyes are misty and suddenly they clear. We knew in an instant we were sharing a meal with Jesus. It was as if God had hidden his destiny from us and then opened our eyes. I looked at Cleopas. He looked at me. We looked back to Jesus, and he had gone. But it didn't matter to us. We knew that he had risen from the dead and that he had taught us that his death was not an accident. It had been planned long ago and set out in the scriptures. It was God's will for his son to die on the cross and rise from the dead. Did it seem as if your heart was burning with hope when he explained the scriptures to us? I said to Cleopas. Although the day was drawing to a close, we could not stay in Emmaus because we were bursting with joy and full of energy. We had to get back to tell the others. So within the hour, we were on our way back to Jerusalem. Our new sense of purpose and joy infused us with energy, and we got there in half the time as our previous journey. Running through the streets of the city, we raced up the stairs and burst into the room. We expected the others to be in the same black mood that they were in when we left them. But we couldn't have been more wrong. They were bristling with a joyful energy just as we were. And before we could give them our news, they told us theirs. It's true. The Lord has risen. Peter has met with him.